Hi everyone, thanks for joining today's webinar, Physical Decrypted Images from Macs with the T2 chip. My name is Julie Urban and I'm the Product Marketing Manager here at BlackBag. Before we get started today, there are a few notes that we'd like to review. We are recording this webinar, so we will share an on-demand version after the webinar is complete. If you have any questions, please submit them in the questions window and we will answer them throughout or in our Q&A at the end of the webinar. I'm excited to introduce our speakers today. We have Dr. Joe Silv and Ashley Hernandez. Dr. Joe Silv is the Director of Research and Development at BlackBag, and he's an adjunct professor of computer science at the University of New Orleans. His interests are in memory analysis, digital forensics, computer security, and operating system internals. He's also the author of several open source digital forensic tools, such as Line Forensics, the first tool set that allows full physical memory acquisition from Android devices. Ashley Hernandez is the Director of Product Development here at BlackBag. She has worked in digital forensics for over 15 years and has taught certified investigators in digital forensics and security topics, including speaking at many digital forensics and law enforcement conferences. Thanks for joining us today. Joe, if you're ready, I will hand the reins over to you to get started.
Thank you. Thank you for attending. I'm very excited to talk about what has pretty much been the last year or so of my life in research and development, and that is physical acquisition and analysis of T2 protected Macs. So we'll talk about a number of topics today. We'll talk about how Apple's encryption works for APFS, both the hardware T2 encryption and the software encryption. We'll talk about how you can image a system with a T2 chip, and we'll talk about what changes you can expect when analyzing these images of T2 systems versus non-T2 systems. We'll also talk about details on the image format that we've decided to use to support T2 chips and APFS fusion devices. And we'll talk about why you should prefer a decrypted physical image when possible over prior techniques such as logical imaging. Just a quick disclaimer, just to avoid the sensationalist headlines. We have not broken Apple's T2 chip. We're not extracting any encryption keys from the chip. Your data is not at risk. In fact, I've been researching this about a year or so, and I'm quite convinced that Apple's new security model is very sound. So if File Vault's enabled, you're still going to need a password or a recovery key to get access to the data. So moving on. First, we're going to talk about how APFS encryption works on non-T2 systems, just to get a background. So this is just going to be a quick refresher for some of you and an introduction for those of you who may not be familiar with APFS encryption. So one slide overview of APFS pooled storage. If you're interested in more details about this, I suggest you check out some of our prior webinars where we go into APFS internals in depth, but this is just sort of a quick overview. So APFS uses a pool storage mechanism, which means it actually allows you to use storage from one or more physical partitions. In most cases, you're only going to have storage from one partition. However, with devices such as APFS fusion drives, you're actually going to have two physically separate physical partitions which are combined together. The blocks from this physical partitions are combined together to form what they call an APFS container. And a container is just a logical collection of the blocks from the various physical partitions. They may not be contiguous. In fact, in the case of fusion drives, they're definitely not contiguous, but they can be used and shared among any number of APFS volumes. So you can create, APFS volumes are very lightweight. You can create as many as you like, up to some reasonable limit. And as these volumes grow or shrink, they borrow and return blocks back to the APFS container. Now we're going to get a little bit into the encryption. And Probably the most important storage location when we're talking about encryption are keybags. Keybags contain all the information that we needed to decrypt the data on disk, such as the encryption keys themselves. There are two types of keybags on APFS. There's a container keybag where you'll have one keybag per container, and a volume keybag where you'll have one keybag per volume. So usually you're only going to have one container keybag, and then you'll have one volume keybag for each of the encrypted volumes on the system. The container keybag holds all the information you need to locate the volume keybags, but also it contains the encryption keys used to actually encrypt data on disk. These encryption keys aren't just stored in plain text here. They're actually encrypted with something called a key encryption key, which we'll get to in the next slide. But once you are able to decrypt the container keybag and decrypt the key encryption key, you're actually able to decrypt all the data. So this is our goal here when we're wanting to analyze APFS software encryption. It's also important to note that the container keybag itself is encrypted, but all of the information you need to decrypt that you can get from reading just unencrypted information that's on the drive. It's only encrypted with some metadata. Similarly, the volume keybags also contain encrypted secrets. They contain encrypted versions of that key encryption key that we need to decrypt the volume encryption key. And because you can have multiple users on the system, but regardless of how many users you have, there's only one volume encryption key in play, these key encryption keys are encrypted with a key that's derived based off of each user's password, and in addition, the recovery key. So all you need is the password of one user on the system or the recovery key, and then you can open the volume keybag, decrypt it with information that is on the drive itself, and then use that key to decrypt the volume encryption key, which is used to encrypt everything else. So once you have the keys, what do you get access to? Well, on APFS, not all blocks on disk are encrypted, but the blocks that contain sensitive data are. So for instance, the blocks in the file system that keep track of the file system metadata, those are encrypted. And of course, the extent data, so the blocks that are on your disk that actually contains your file data, those are encrypted as well. So using either the recovery key or any one of the user's passwords, if you put an encrypted APFS software encrypted image into BlackLight, you're going to be able to get access to all of this data. Decryption itself can be done in software, so the blocks can be decrypted on demand at analysis time. Are there any questions about kind of the quick APFS overview and software decryption before we move on to how this differs in the T2?
There is one question, Joe. There was a question regarding currently our APFS decryption support for software. When we do the acquisition in MacQuisition, we acquire the data and then we can do the decryption later at analysis time. The question was clarifying, are we able to do the decryption even when T2 chip is not involved at the time of acquisition for software-based encryption right now?
Well, right now, when we have a software encrypted image, we're preferring to just take an image of how all the data physically exist on disk because there's no limitation. So right now, you do have the option of in MacQuisition of putting in the user's password and mounting that volume. That's mostly for triage and logical acquisition. When you take an image from MacQuisition of a software encrypted APFS disk, you're going to get the encrypted information in that disk. And when you bring it into BlackLight, BlackLight's going to decrypt it on demand. Now that's going to be different when we get to T2 chips, which we're going to talk about in a moment.
That was the only question so far, Joe. Thanks for answering that.
All right, moving on. So we're going to talk a little bit now about how the encryption process differs on T2 systems. And remember, this is enabled by default on T2 hardware. So first we'll talk a little bit about the Apple T2 chip itself. So starting in late 2017, 2017, most new Macs started shipping with custom T2 security chips, which are embedded right into the disk controllers. In fact, these chips are the controllers themselves. Among other things, the T2 chips serve two primary functions. One, they have a small amount of what they call effaceable storage, which is used to store out-of-band encrypted secrets. And by out-of-band means you can actually put some information on the chip itself that's not written to the disk itself, right? So if you're only reading from the disk, you're not necessarily getting all of the data. And more importantly, the T2 chip itself contains a cryptographic engine that is used to perform a number of cryptographic operations on hardware, such as key unwrapping and most of the actual encryption and decryption itself. Each and every individual T2 chip also has its own unique set of encryption keys, which are embedded inside the chip itself. And as far as we're aware, there is no practical way of retrieving or brute forcing these keys from the chip without destroying the chip itself. And if you destroy the chip, you're not going to be able to get access to the data. By default, all the APFS volumes that contain user data on T2 protected systems are encrypted. And this hardware-assisted encryption works slightly differently than the software encryption that we just discussed. It is not possible to decrypt data without using the specific T2 chip from a specific protected system. That's very important. You're going to need the actual hardware to decrypt the image. You're not going to be able to take an image of the system without doing the decryption and then bringing it back to another system. Even if that system has a T2 chip, it doesn't have the same T2 chip with its own unique cryptographic keys needed to decrypt that data. Fortunately, the Apple T2 chip is interactable with software, either from a booted system through our MacQuisition's pre-boot environment, which now does boot on T2 systems, as well as through target disk mode. So if you're not able to boot into a pre-boot environment for some reason, you can still boot these systems into target disk mode and image them from another Mac system, as long as that other Mac system is running OS X 10.13 or higher. In addition, we mentioned the effaceable storage. Just a side note, if the effaceable storage, which is only a small amount of storage, if this storage is somehow destroyed or wiped, you're not going to be able to decrypt this information at all. So that's why you really should not try to tamper with the T2 chip itself, because if you try to remove this T2 chip and you erase the effaceable storage, the data that's encrypted on the disk is going to be completely unrecoverable. Okay, now we're going to get into some subtle differences on how the keybags work on hardware-assisted T2 encrypted systems versus the software encryption. In T2 systems, you still have the same keybags. You have your container keybags and your volume keybags, and they contain the same sort of information. But however, these encrypted keybags are no longer encrypted with keys that you can just read off of the drive. In fact, they're encrypted with something that they're calling a media key, which is randomly generated per system. And as well, they're encrypted using the hardware encryption for the T2 chip. So you can't even decrypt these things in software. You have to use the T2 chip itself to decrypt these keybags. The media key is stored in that effaceable storage on the T2 chip that we talked about. So you can take this wrap media key, read this from the T2 chip, and the T2 chip can unwrap it for you. But that's only going to give you what we call a protected media key. And this protected key is not the same key that is actually used to decrypt the data. So you can't just take this protected key and decrypt the data in software. You need to take the protected key and the actual encrypted data that you're trying to decrypt and give them both to the T2 chip, and then the T2 chip will give you back the decrypted data. There's no way of actually getting the real encryption key that is used to encrypt this data out of the T2 chip. The volume encryption key, the volume key bags work very similarly on T2 systems as they do on our traditional APFS encrypted systems. However, again, you've got these protected keys that can only be used by the T2 chip itself, which protect the key encryption keys. And in addition, if file vault is enabled, which file vault is not enabled by default, even though encryption is enabled by default, if file vault's enabled, there's an additional layer of encryption wrapping these keys that are protected by either the recovery key or any one of the user's passwords. And after we've gotten these protected keys from the keybags, using the T2 chip to decrypt the keybags for us, you still need to interface with the T2 chip to decrypt all the file system and metadata blocks. There's no way to ask the T2 chip to return these keys, so you can do it at analysis time. You actually have to pass the encrypted data and the protected keys to the T2 chip, and what you're going to do is you're going to get back decrypted version of that information from the T2 chip itself. Because the T2 chip is responsible for all of the encryption, it is not impossible to decrypt this data at analysis time like we can do with software encrypted images. So just a quick one-slide comparison between software and hardware encryption. When software encryption is used, all the data that we need to decrypt this information is stored on disk with the addition of a user's password that obviously may not be stored on disk. But in hardware encryption, there's additional information that's actually stored in the individual T2 chip itself, such as that effaceable storage and the unique encryption keys that are embedded to a specific T2 chip. Software encryption keys can be determined, the data can be decrypted in software only. That's not the case with hardware encryption. You need the specific T2 chip in play to decrypt this data. Software, in addition to an image of the disk, you need a recovery key or the user's password. That's all you need to decrypt this. But again, you're going to need the T2 chip to decrypt this versus hardware. And the rest of these points just kind of nail that down. Software encryption can happen after acquisition, but to practically decrypt information for forensic use on T2 systems, you're going to have to do this at acquisition time on the live system or through target disk mode. So are there any questions about T2 encryption?
We do have a couple of questions, Joe. The first question is, what if they have a image from either another tool or from a prior version of MacQuisition of a T2 system? Are they able to decrypt that in BlackLight or in any way using MacQuisition?
Unfortunately not. If you've taken a physical encrypted image where it's just reading all the data as it exists on disk, because the only way to decrypt that data would have been to interface with the T2 chip at the time of acquisition, those images are largely useless at this point.
All right, and then another question is, can any user password, whether it's a standard or administrative password, decrypt the entire volume, or do you need passwords for each volume? How does the password and decryption work together?
Yes, for each volume, you have only a single encryption key that's used to encrypt all the data. So it doesn't matter how many users you have on the system, that same encryption key will be accessed if you just provide any one of those users' passwords, or of course, if you provide the recovery key. So individual users' data is not encrypted differently from any other user. It's just volume-specific keys.
Okay, if you don't have the password, is there anything that we can do with MacQuisition at acquisition time to be able to decrypt the data or get it into a state where you could add the password later?
Unfortunately not, because again, we're going to have to be able to decrypt this stuff at acquisition time, and without the password, it's not possible to decrypt at acquisition time.
All right. Let's see. There's a couple of questions about which models. I know you mentioned earlier starting in 2017, but which devices might they see the T2 chip on? And is there any way for them to identify that a system has the T2 chip? Kind of combining a couple questions there.
Yes. So the first system that had these T2 chips on them was the original, it's the iMac Pro that came out in late 2017. Since then, I believe all of the Macs that came out after that, so all of the Macs that came out in 2018, all of those have T2 chips, and all of the Macs that came out in 2019, with the exception of the new iMac. One of the new iMacs has a Fusion drive in it, and the T2 chip doesn't work with Fusion drive, so they don't have T2 chips in play on those. As far as a way of knowing whether it's a T2 encrypted system, MacQuisition will identify this for you. It'll identify whether it's a T2 encrypted device or it's not. Otherwise, you're just going to have to look up information about the specific model of computer you have.
All right. There's also a question here about what if a user creates a volume, an additional APFS volume other than like the standard APFS volume that's in the device? Is that going to be accessible and decrypted as well?
Yes, it should be.
And then I'm going to do one more. We have a lot of questions, so I will add some more. I think some of the questions that are coming in you're going to cover next, but one more question of clarification is, if it is not, if File Vault is not enabled, if there are no user passwords set on the device, I know that it does try and encourage you to do that, but if it's not set, do they need anything else during acquisition to be able to get a decrypted physical image from a T2 chip?
If File Vault is not enabled, with these T2 systems, your data is still encrypted on disk, so you're still going to need like a version of MacQuisition 2019 R1. However, you're not going to be prompted to enter any sort of user's password or recovery key because that's not needed. You're still needed to interface with the T2 chip to decrypt that stuff, but you don't need a user's password because the encryption key doesn't have that one additional layer of encryption.
Awesome. We have a lot more. I'm going to try and hold some of them until your next section because I think some of these are going to be answered, but if you want to go ahead and move forward, let's go ahead and keep going.
Okay. Now that we've learned a little bit about how our physical acquisitions work, I want to talk a little bit about the different options you have or have had up until now to image T2 systems. If you've taken a physically encrypted, a physical image of the encrypted data on a T2 system, which is just a bit-by-bit copy of what's written to the disk, unfortunately, those types of images are going to be largely useless. There's no way to decrypt that image without using the T2 chip itself, and these keys do rotate over time, so there's no guarantee that you would even be able to interface with the chip after the fact. Although that is an area of research for us. What you're able to do now is to be able to create what we're calling a physical decrypted image, which is you're going to get all of the physical data from the disk. We're still imaging the blocks on disk. However, the blocks that we're able to identify that are encrypted and we're able to decrypt, rather than imaging the encrypted version of that, we're decrypting it using the T2 chip and imaging that. That way you're still getting the disk, you're still getting images where you get the data how it's logically laid out on disk when possible. And your other option, and this has pretty much been your option that you've had with tools such as MacQuisition 2018 and others, is to do a logical copy. And logical copies basically are just using the file system interfaces to copy files and read metadata, right? So you're going to get logical copies of the file data and a limited amount of metadata that the file system will give you from user space. This is going to use file system interfaces to collect data, but much of the data, underlying data, is still going to be inaccessible for you. All of the active files you'll be able to get, you're going to be able to get most of the metadata, but not everything. And we'll talk about specific examples. So if logical imaging is your only option, then great, that's what you should do. But you should really prefer physical images if you all have the opportunity. And with MacQuisition 2019 R1, this is now giving you the option of taking these physical, useful physical images from these T2 protected systems. So just a little bit of a recap. What do you need to know at acquisition time to create these images with MacQuisition? So physical decrypted images can be created using MacQuisition 2019 R1, which is going to be released very, very soon. You can either boot into the pre-boot environment, using that to boot into MacQuisition, or you can mount the system via target disk mode to another macOS 10.13 system. If File Vault is enabled, which it is not by default, but can be enabled by our user, at acquisition time, in addition, you're going to need either the recovery key or any one user's password. Currently, we're not able to decrypt unallocated space. Again, this is an area of open research. So the unallocated space, if you image it, is still going to be encrypted, and we're not really going to have a way to decrypt that. Because of this, we have an option to allow you to skip any of these unallocated blocks that we're not able to decrypt, and that's just going to make the imaging process go a little bit faster and your image to be a little bit smaller, which could be substantially smaller if you're dealing with a system that has a 2 to 4 terabyte drive on it. And we're using MacQuisition 2019 R1 for these decrypted T2 physical images, and as well as fusion drives. We haven't talked about fusion drives because it's a bit out of the scope of this image, but MacQuisition 2019 R1 is actually able to create physical images of APFS fusion drives, which is good because the new iMac comes with fusion drives, so I guess these things aren't going away, that you can actually analyze in BlackLight 2019 R1. So how does this work? Well, if you're at all familiar with MacQuisition, this is just a one-slide screenshot. It's very, very easy. What you're going to do is you're going to click on the APFS container image, which is a little bit different than what you're used to. Usually we have recommended clicking on this disk 0, which is the physical image, the physical disk image. But that's not going to work for us in this case. You're going to actually have to click on the APFS container, and then you're going to choose your format. We're using AFF4 right now, and you can either choose a compressed image or an uncompressed image, and then you click image device, and it does all the decryption for you. If it is encrypted with File Vault, it'll prompt you for the user's password at this time, which you're going to have to provide. So I mentioned AFF4. Some of you may not be familiar with AFF4. AFF4 is an imaging format that's based off of an open standard, which has been peer-reviewed over multiple papers over the last 5 or so years. It's supported by a number of popular forensics tools today, and there are many more tools adding support for this format. Well, we chose the AFF4 format because it is an open standard, which means any tool can implement it, and you're not going to just be locked into one proprietary vendor standard. It only works in BlackBag tools, for example. It'll work in any tool that can support this open standard. And because it has additional features that other image formats lack, such as sparse or non-linear imaging, which means we can image blocks out of order, which is very convenient when you're dealing with APFS encryption because only a subset of those blocks are encrypted. And sparse images means you don't have to image every single block on the disk. So for example, the blocks that we're dealing with that we can't decrypt, you can optionally not image those, and then it's fine. It also supports a number of compression algorithms that are much faster than those that are supported in other image formats, such as LZ4. And LZ4 is a newer compression algorithm that is, it has the size benefits of like deflate, which would be what you're used to for like in an E01, for example, but it's several orders of magnitude faster to both encrypt and decrypt. So that allows you to image and analyze these images much, much faster. It also provides the flexibility we needed to efficiently image decrypted and unencrypted data while optionally skipping data that we're not able to decrypt, such as currently unallocated space. And importantly for APFS fusion drives, since I mentioned these containers aren't contiguous, they have large gaps in them. You're able to handle non-contiguous APFS containers, such as those found in fusion drives. And we weren't aware of any other image format that we could do this with. So once you have your AFF4 image created from MacQuisition, what does the analysis side look like on BlackLight? Well, fortunately, the analysis side on BlackLight looks pretty much identical to what you're used to when you're dealing with regular APFS encrypted images. BlackLight 2019 R1 is going to be able to parse AFF4 physical images that are created by MacQuisition. And it should support those from other tools, but for right now, we're limiting it to MacQuisition created tools in our official statement for T2 infusion drives. All file system metadata is exposed, and all snapshots are fully able to be parsed, just like you would for any unencrypted or software encrypted APFS image. And once you add this image to BlackLight, all of our normal analysis features are available. There's no limitations for this T2 encrypted devices that you would not have with any other physical image. You're going to be able to get pretty much the exact same sort of data out of it. Because you've decrypted this at acquisition time, at analysis time, you're not going to be prompted to enter a user's password or recovery key because the data is already going to be decrypted in the image. So first, a slide. If you've taken an encrypted physical image previously and you try to bring that into BlackLight, a encrypted T2 image, BlackLight is gonna be able to identify that, and it's going to notify you that this volume is an Apple T2 encrypted and it's locked. It can only be decrypted at the source with MacQuisition and a password. So you're unfortunately going to have to create a new image at this time. You're not even going to get the option of selecting those. Now you can select the other partitions that don't contain user data, such as the pre-boot or the recovery partitions, but not much else. Now, if you do bring in an image that you created, a decrypted physical image, everything looks pretty much exactly as it would if you were bringing in another image. You're going to have be able to select all of the volumes because they've now been decrypted. The encrypted volumes tell you if they were encrypted. However, you're not going to be prompted to enter a password at this time because the data is already decrypted. BlackLight's able to recognize that. So are there any questions about what we've talked about?
Yes, we have quite a few questions. So the first question is about the speed it takes for decryption. How will the impact of doing decryption at acquisition time impact the speed of us being able to create the image?
That's a great question. And surprisingly to me, because the T2 chips are actually embedded in the disk controllers themselves, there is no noticeable slowdown in reading and decrypting this image than there is for creating an image if you're not trying to decrypt that stuff. I believe the process isn't such that where you have to read the encrypted image in memory and pass it to the chip and then read it back down. The T2 chip is actually able to directly access the encrypted information from the SSD since it's built into the SSD's controller, and it's very fast. I mean, I'm getting 2 gigabyte a second reads on my system, which is going to be faster than you're able to write to, certainly.
Awesome. And the next question is, when we do the acquisition, is there a way for them to distinguish in the image that's created that it was extracted from a device with the T2 chip?
The image itself that you're creating is going to have embedded metadata into it. That's another benefit of AFF4. It allows us to embed a number of metadata information about that. So that image itself is actually going to already know whether it was created with a T2 chip, whether it was a standard image, whether it was a fusion image, and things like that. So all of that is already handled for you in the imaging process.
All right. And then there was a question about, is there a time frame on the T2 chip? Like, does the information held in it change over time? Or if you had one of these old T2 systems from a year ago and you weren't able to do any access from it, is it still able to pull the information it needs to be able to do the decryption?
So the keys do rotate over time with use of the system, which is why we're not even sure it'll be possible in the future to take an image that you've already created with the encrypted information and bring it to the same system and decrypt it, because these keys change over time. However, it's not like this data expires. So if you have the T2 system itself that's powered down and you have it in your evidence storage, you can boot it up today with MacQuisition 2019 R1 and create an image, and it's going to be fine.
There are a couple clarifying questions about target disk mode versus booting into MacQuisition, if there's any differences there, as well as is there anything on the T2 systems that prevents booting into a external startup disk? Could you talk a little bit more about the different modes that we have when working with MacQuisition and if there's any differences there?
Yeah, there's slight differences. Most of these new systems have some additional security put into them. They don't allow you to boot into just any non-Apple device. So to boot, we've got a blog post on this. On a T2 system, to boot into MacQuisition, you need to first boot into the recovery partition and disable some security, which is going to require you to have an administrator's password on the system. Now, if you don't have an administrator's password on the system, you're not going to be able to boot into MacQuisition's pre-boot environment on the system. But what you will be able to do is put that system in target disk mode and image it from a system you have. Now, you're still going to need a user's password to decrypt it if FileVault's enabled, but it could be any user, not necessarily an administrator user. Does that fully answer the question, Ashley? Ashley, am I alone here?
Sorry, that whole mute button. That does answer it, thank you. We have another question about APFS snapshots and if those are still able to be extracted and decrypted using the latest version.
They absolutely are. APFS snapshots, all the information that's needed to parse those snapshots, we are able to decrypt and leave them on in the physical image as they exist. So when you bring those into a tool like BlackLight, you still be able to parse them completely.
Thank you. And then one more question is a clarification around the wording we have around optional unallocated space. So I know that right now you mentioned it's not able to be decrypted if it was encrypted and unallocated. So they get the choice to acquire unallocated or not unallocated. Are both of those images still going to be the physical image, or how does it work when you disable to collect unallocated space?
Yes, they're both still physical images, but as we mentioned, we chose AFF4 import because it allows sparse imaging, which means you don't have to image every single block on the disk. So if you disable the imaging of unallocated space, we're identifying which blocks are unallocated, and we're just not imaging those. Those won't be stored in the image itself. However, everything else will be logically laid out the same. When you bring those images, images into BlackLight, for instance, if you looked to where one of these blocks you didn't image were, it's just going to read back all zeros instead of, nothing.
Great. And last question is in regards to hashing. How does hashing work with AFF4?
So hashing works the same as you would do normally. Currently, what we're doing in this initial version of MacQuisition, we're hashing the image itself that you're creating, right? So AFF4, it has an image that you're hashing the data in it. It also has some metadata that is embedded in the image. So after you create the AFF4 image, MacQuisition 2019 R1 is hashing that image for you, and you can take that image and then hash it with any MD5 or any SHA-1 utility so you can verify that that image hasn't changed. We're exploring other hashing options to hash the individual data streams so that you can do reproducible images, but that's going to be in future versions.
Great. We have a few more questions, and I'll group them for our next question break, but go ahead and move forward.
Okay. So I promised you that we'd focus a little bit more on why we think this is going to really impact your investigations and why we think that being able to decrypt these physical images is a good thing and is an improvement over to what we've been able to offer in the past with our logical imaging of T2 systems. So why should you prefer physical imaging options over logical imaging options? Well, logical acquisitions collect data and metadata through file system interfaces. And usually this collected data is going to be limited to the active files on the system and whatever metadata you get by running various userland tools, such as XRs. Physical acquisitions attempt to collect the data as it exists on disk. It's going to collect as much data as possible, whether or not we're using it right now in its original format or in its decrypted version of the original format. Physical images are going to give you many more options for analysis and recovery of historical or deleted data. And this information is usually not going to be exposed via file system interfaces, so your logical acquisition tools aren't going to be able to get that information for you. In addition to what we can parse today, having a physical image, having the data, how it exists on disk, opens us up to the possibility that future methodologies for data recovery that we may create will be able to take your old images that you created a year prior and get more information out of those that you weren't able to get at the time because that methodology didn't exist. And we're actually creating new recovery methodologies for APFS all the time, and that's simply because APFS is so new. We're still learning different areas where data is hidden from us. And you may have heard recently some claims that logical images are good enough to collect all the data. I'm here to say that that's patently false, and I'm going to give you a few examples of data that can only be recovered from physical images. So APFS containers have something called the free queue, and this is an example of another artifact that we've only recently discovered that you can get information from. Previously, we were able to carve just on unallocated information, but APFS containers actually contain a free queue of blocks that they still have marked allocated, but haven't marked as unallocated yet. And in some cases, that can be a lot of data. For example, in this image that I have a screenshot on the slide here, the space manager is telling us this is a 60 gigabyte APFS container. And 1 gigabyte of blocks, over 1 gig of blocks, are stored in this APFS free queue. So these are allocated blocks that aren't referenced anywhere else in the file system. If we just collect these blocks and parse on them and carve on them, we were able to carve over 600 files, 648 files, including images and documents and FS events and plist and all kinds of things. So this is 600 files and over a gig of data that you would not have collected if you had done just a logical acquisition. While it is possible to mount snapshots read-only on a system and do logical acquisition from the snapshot itself, APFS actually has a class of snapshots that they call Dataless. And Dataless is sort of a misnomer. There's still data there. All it means is that they're guaranteed only to preserve the blocks that contain the file system metadata, and the file system, the blocks that back your actual files, those are not guaranteed to be preserved. They may be overwritten. Well, some of these dataless snapshots, for whatever reason, aren't actually mountable by OS X. So if they're not mountable, you're not able to do a logical acquisition. However, if you have a physical acquisition and you bring this stuff into BlackLight, we can still we can still parse these snapshots, even these unmountable dataless snapshots. And in some cases, there's some information there that you won't be able to get in the other snapshots or the active partition. And this one example, we parsed all of the different snapshots and the main thing, and we put it into BlackLight, and there are about 32,000 files that are unique to this dataless snapshot alone. Those are 32,000 files that we're now going to be able to collect on T2 systems that we would not be able to collect before. And among those files were 2 complete iOS backups, one for an iPhone and one for an iPod Touch. So without being able to parse these dataless snapshots, we would not be able to recover those iOS backups and parse those as well. Now, this example is not an example from a T2 system because, as I mentioned, right now we're not able to decrypt the unallocated space. However, we've made great progress on that. In future versions of MacQuisition, we're hopeful we'll be able to solve this problem. But even on SSDs that have trim enabled, APFS images still have a lot of data in unallocated space. And in this instance, and this is the same image that we've been talking about with the 60 gigs, and it's from an SSD. There were over 27,000 files recovered from unallocated space on this SSD from a MacBook Air. And that, again, that's including pictures and documents and all the things that you would definitely be interested in viewing. They're going to have forensic value, but you will not be able to collect currently with logical imaging techniques. APFS itself is what we call a copy on write file system, which means when its metadata objects are changed, say you're changing a timestamp or something like that, rather than changing only the few bytes of that on disk, an entirely new object is created with the updated information, and the old object is released, but not necessarily overwritten. So we can carve through the free queue in unallocated space looking for old versions of these objects. So in this instance, we're looking for volume superblocks, which is just one specific type of object that we can carve for. And we were able to recover 87 previous versions of these volume superblocks. Now, volume superblocks themselves contain records of the last 8 times the volume was unmounted, as well as the kernel extension, the APFS kernel extension that was used. By analyzing these 87 blocks that we were able to recover, we were able to get information about 41 unique times that these volumes were unmounted and their associated KEX. So that's good forensic information that you would not be able to get otherwise unless you had the actual disk as the blocks exist on the disk itself. And one last example here, file slack is still a thing. When you create, you're not going to get file slack on APFS through normal conditions because when blocks are allocated for a new file, they are first zeroed out. However, there still is going to be some unused data between the last end of the file, logical data of that file, and the last block, right, that's allocated for it. And a malicious actor can actually hide data in these files. And there's many examples of this happening, and then there are even open source quote unquote file systems that allow you to store files and data in Slack space themselves. And in this example, we've hidden some data in the file Slack that says this password is and gives you a number. This is with the password. I'm not going to read that out loud. But if you just did a logical acquisition of this airbag.pdf, the data would stop at the end of the PDF data, at the data that's here showing in black. With being able to image the blocks as they exist on disk, we can find this hidden data. So in conclusion, and of course I'll answer your questions, but these are the key takeaways. Most Mac systems starting in late 2017 are now relying on these T2 security chips. Each of these individual chips contain unique encryption keys that can never leave the chip itself. Since each of these chips are unique, you're going to need the original hardware to create a successful image. Decryption needs to happen at acquisition time using MacQuisition 2019 R1, which is the first and currently only tool that's going to be able to do this. And if file vault's enabled, you're going to need to either the recovery key or any one of the user's password at acquisition time now to create a successful decrypted image. We're using the AFF4 format for evidence from both T2 devices and APFS fusion drives. And our physical images are going to allow recovery of more information that is going to help your case than our current logical support. Now, I will open it up again to any questions about anything that we've had.
All right, so a few questions. There is a question about, is there any difference if the T2 system has Mojave versus High Sierra, or does that affect it at all?
No, no, either one of these things work pretty much exactly the same way.
All right, and then there's also a question about, are we able to gather RAM from the Mojave systems? You mentioned booting and some other options. Is that also part of it? I know that the question
Yes,
is,
MacQuisition 2019 R1 is able to do RAM collection from Mojave systems.
all right. And then we have a couple questions about file slack. So just to reiterate, is file slack collected? And if so, is file slack likely to be encrypted or unencrypted when we get these physical images?
File slack is collected, but because we're decrypting the entire block of information, when you create a decrypted information, this file slack is not going to be encrypted. It will be decrypted as well. Now, of course, if the bad actor is storing encrypted data in the file slack, that's still going to need to be decrypted, but not because of anything that the file system is doing.
All right. When they enter in the user's credentials or the recovery key for doing the decryption, there was a couple questions about when they're prompted, but also can they tell if they've successfully provided the correct username or password in MacQuisition when we're going to do the acquisition?
Yes, you'll be prompted when you're selecting the options you want to do for imaging, and you select that you would like to image it. At that point, you will be prompted for a password, and it will immediately tell you if your password guess was correct or not.
All right, and then the next question, well, actually, there's several people who've had this question, so I'll just address it now. People are asking about when the release dates are. So both BlackLight and MacQuisition release dates are scheduled for the spring. Obviously, we're in spring, so it's pretty soon. We're working on just finishing up the BlackLight release that will support ingesting these AFF4 images, and then the MacQuisition release will go out after that. That actually supports the ability to create these. So both of those are coming soon. So we'll answer that one just so you don't have to talk more about that. There was a question of, do any other tools besides BlackLight support AFF4, or is AFF4 proprietary in any way? Can you just reiterate a little bit about AFF4 and have some?
No, AFF4 is an open image standard that has been vetted and has been around for quite some time. And yeah, several different tools support it. I don't know if Ashley wants me rattling off competitors' names, but I'm going to do it anyway. I know Xways is a good example, and they support both APFS and AFF4, and at least in some capacity, APFS, at least in some capacity. And no, it's not proprietary in any way. And in fact, that's one of the reasons we chose it, is we don't want to be creating another imaging format that suits our needs, that people have to reverse engineer and support in their other tools if it ever gets popular enough. We want to use an existing standard that people are already using, that anyone can use, and that is royalty free. And that's why we chose AFF4.
So there are some additional questions about the AFF4 image. I don't think we're going to be able to get to all of those in this webinar, but one question was, is it a logical format, or is it similar to a DD image, or more similar to a EO1 evidence file format? Can you just at a high level talk about kind of what type of image?
Currently standardized it's a physical image format. So you're going to store more. It's more an analog to an E01 than an L01, right? However, currently the paper just went through peer review and is about to be published to extend the standard to support logical collection of files too. So in the future, you'll be able to use AFF4, the same format, to store logical acquisitions as well.
All right. Then we have a question about Is there any limits on the number of passwords they can try, or is there any interface to try and brute force a password, since the password will have to try to be entered at acquisition time?
There is no limit. You can try entering passwords until your heart content. I do not believe we have an interface to just like put a list of passwords, but I will take that into account as a great suggestion for future versions.
I think the need to now have the password acquisition time does actually make a difference. So just to reiterate, what Joe said several times, you can have either the user password or the recovery key or the admin password. And also I saw a couple people still asking, if File Vault's not enabled, do you need any password?
You
And
do
the answer
not.
is no, you do not. So I know that has come up quite a few times. I think those are the general questions. There's some specifics that we'll respond to, as I know we're running to the end of time. But was there any other items, Joe, you just wanted to reiterate? I don't think there's any more questions that we need to cover.
No, I think we've covered a lot. Feel free to reach out to us on social media and ask any questions you like. We will be releasing a bit more technical information about this in the future. For those of you who want to get down into the weeds with us, and look forward to reading about other features that are going to be in BlackLight 2019 R1, because there are a lot of them.
Thanks, Joe. I think that's it for today, Julie.
Awesome. Thank you, Joe and Ashley, for walking us all through our new T2 chip capabilities and what we can expect in upcoming releases of BlackLight and MacQuisition. So if you submitted a question today and we didn't get a chance to answer it, we will be reaching out to you and following up individually, so we will get to you. Also, as a reminder, we will send the recording of this webinar out, so everyone stay tuned for that. If you're interested in learning more, please reach out to sales@blackbagtech.com if you want to learn any more about BlackBag or any of our products and services. Please make sure to follow us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn at blackbagtech.com. And if you want more information, you can subscribe to our blog at blackbagtech.com. Thank you again, Joe and Ashley, and thank you everyone for joining. Have a great day.